Jan Hicks Creates here, coming back at you with my basics of cross stitch lesson number 11. I did notice I didn't put the number on my last one, stitching with beads, so I went back and corrected that. So that was number 10, this is number 11. Today I'm going to be talking to you about how to transition from stitching on Aida to stitching on Evenweave. There is no reason why you need to if you don't want to, but there are a lot of people who have never stitched on Evenweave and are curious about it, who want to give it a try. You may decide it's not for you, and that's perfectly fine. There's a lot of gorgeous Aida cloths, Aida dyers out there. So this video is just going to talk about some things to think about when you're making that transition. I'm going to I'm not going to talk about what Evenweave fabric is, because I did cover that in my basics of cross stitch lesson on fabric, but I'm going to talk about what you need to think about when you're transitioning, what specific Evenweave you want to use for your first few pieces, what type of chart you should choose, and then some tips on when you're actually stitching that will help your brain make that jump from the squares of Aida to the threads of Evenweave. And we will be looking closely at both of those so you can kind of have a good look at what the difference is and what your eye needs to be seeing. So I am going to get my camera turned around and I will join you at my work table. Hold on one second. Okay, so I have in front of me several different samples of Evenweave fabric as well as the Aida. This is my poor little piece of Aida that has been through the ringer over the course of the 10 videos that I've done here. I guess I didn't use this on all of them, but it certainly has seen its fair share of the work, and it's still pretty stiff. I have to say, even after being washed and dried, it was not ironed after I did the running test, the floss test on whether the colors bled or not, but it is still pretty stiff. And so I don't know whether I mentioned this in my video on fabric, but that's one of the properties of Aida. Aida will soften up over time and handling, but it's pretty stiff to begin with, whereas the Evenweaves are pretty drapey. Not all Evenweaves are created equally. A lot of it has to do with the content and the weave. Their witch-out linen is known to be a stiffer linen than Zweigart. So, but for the most part, Aida is a little bit stiffer. So the first question that I want to answer that I get asked fairly frequently is, how do you know when you're ready to transition from Aida to an Evenweave? And my answer is basically, you don't. I mean, I would say when you're starting to get curious about stitching on the Evenweaves, that's when you need to give it a try. Get a little piece and give it a try. A lot of people are intimidated at the thought of stitching on an Evenweave, and hopefully this video will help take some of that intimidation away. So let's look at a little bit at what we're talking about here with the different types of fabric. And like I said, I did cover the different fabric types in depth in my basics of cross stitch video on fabric. So I encourage you to go look at that if you didn't see it yet, to get an understanding of what Evenweave is compared to Aida, and what the two different types of Evenweave are and why they're called Evenweave. There's a lot to go into there, but like I said, it's all in that video. The most obvious difference, of course, is that Aida has the squares, which make it so easy to stitch. You know exactly where your needle has to go up and down to form our wonderful little squares. On the Evenweaves, this is a piece of 28 count Jobelin, and this is a piece of 36 count linen from XJU Design. This colorway of the Jobelin is called Bay Leaf. I'm not sure which company that is. So the immediate difference is that you can see the squares on the Aida, and this is a piece of 14 count Aida. And on the even weaves, the linen and the Jobelin, you have the threads that you have to count over. Let me switch this around so that selvage edge, that whipped edge isn't there. So you have the different threads you have to count over. The difference, immediate difference you can see in these two even weaves, and again, the even weave is just because they are the same vertically, the warp and the weft threads on both are both even. 28 count this way, 28 count that way. So that means 28 threads per inch vertically, 28 threads per inch horizontally. Same over here, 36 threads per inch horizontally, 36 threads per inch vertically. That's all even weave means. But on these, of course, you have threads you have to count rather than nice squares presented to you. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky. But we're going to try and take some of that intimidation away, like I said, and help you get started on experimenting with even weaves. So I encourage you, when you're just starting out, I'm going to put my piece of 36 count linen aside, because when you are starting out, I encourage you to start with with the ones that are called even weave. Linen is called linen for the most part, and the Jobelin, Lugana, Murano, Monaco, those are all called even weaves. I encourage you to start with a 28 count, simply because it's bigger. The holes are usually clearer. It's not a small count that you have to count over the threads to see. Okay? So you want to start with a 28 count. You're going to start your piece just like you would any other cross stitch piece. You'll decide whether you want to start in the middle, whether you want to start on a corner. You're going to fold your piece and find the middle just like any other design, right? Where it gets tricky is counting the threads. And I want to encourage you to slow down when you're transitioning to the even weave. Don't worry about how fast or how slow you're counting, you're stitching, how much you are getting done. Slow down and actually count the threads. Don't worry that at first it seems awkward. Don't worry that you might miscount for a while. I promise you that before long, your eyes will start seeing the squares formed by these threads. So whenever you're starting on Aida, you don't really have to think about where you're starting. All the squares are equal, basically. Not so on linen or even weave. For the linen or even weave, again, you find the center, but then you want to look and find, and let me see if I can get in close here without it getting blurry. You want to find a place where there is a vertical thread over top of the horizontal thread. Do you see the vertical thread in the weave here? The vertical is laying over top of the horizontal. This is sometimes called leaning against the post. So your first stitch, the first half of your stitch is going to be here. So whether you start in the, like my first leg is always slanting to the right. So, and it doesn't matter whether I start in the bottom left corner or the upper right. I still have a vertical thread that I'm going over. The same if your first stitch slants to the left. You want to find the place where the vertical thread is laying over top of the horizontal thread. All right? Vertical, horizontal. So I'm going to start with the loop method. There's my vertical thread. I go down in the top, come up in the bottom left. And since this is just my first stitch, I'm not going to really talk about it that much. Let's just get it established. Okay, so get my thread in here. So like I said, I encourage you to slow down and to count. And you're going to need to count at the beginning. So when you're making your crosses, when you hear the over 2 on 28 count Lugana, 28 count Jobelin in this case, your thread is going over 2 of the linen threads, 2 of the fabric threads. So I'm going to come up. So my thread is coming down in the upper right. I'm going to slide it down 1, 2, and come up in the bottom left of the next stitch. Now I need to go down in the upper right. So 1, I could count vertically, 1, 2. Don't even be ashamed to count across. 1, if you're having a hard time eyeing where that vertical is, which is perfectly legitimate, count 1, 2, and then up 1, 2, and go down. Going to come down in the bottom, going to come down and come up again in the bottom left. So again, underneath, I'm sliding my needle 1, 2, so I make sure I'm coming up in the right place. I need to go down in the diagonal one, right? So 1, 2, 1, 2. And this does, I tell you, it really will get easier. Your eye will see it more. I'm going to come back across that row. And of course, once you have stitches already in place, I'm just going to use the sewing method to come back. Once you have the stitches already in place, you know, it's easy to do that return row, right? All right, so let's say I want to drop down here and do another row underneath. So I'm going to take my needle down, and so that means I have to drop down four lines, 4 threads. So I've come down in the upper left here, 1, 2, 3, 4. Need to go down in the diagonal. Now I don't have to count this one, right? Because I already have this square above in place. So I know I go down there. Come down to the bottom right. Again, I don't have to count the next one because the square above is in place. There's where I went down. Come down 1, 2, and go down above. And I'm just going to sewing method coming back. So what happens if you have to jump from where you're stitching to a place somewhere away from it? That's more counting, right? And this is where I encourage you to be very careful, count multiple times. In this particular instance, I'm going to say I have to start 3 stitches over from where I am now. So I came down here in the upper left. I count 2, that's 1 stitch, 2, that's 2 stitches. Now, the next stitch is the one I want to stitch, so I'm skipping 2 and coming down in the 3rd stitch. I could come down, or I could start the stitch in the upper right this time, and that would be having the thread coming straight across from where I went down to where I'm coming up. I prefer to have the stitch slanted a bit more because that just makes this stitch lay better. So I'm actually going to come diagonally down, and my stitch is going to go here. Now, before I make that stitch, I bring the thread up, but before I make the stitch, I go ahead and count again. What's the saying? Count twice, rip none? I don't remember what the saying is. So I'm going to count again. 1, there's 2 threads for 1, there's 2 threads for 2, and so this next square is correct. That's where I'm stitching. So I'm going over 2, up 2 to go down in the upper right. Going to come down 2 threads and come up in the bottom right, and then finish it off. Now, I talked about leaning against the post, where to start your stitch. I didn't tell you why. You want to start it with that vertical thread being on top, because that helps to hold that bottom leg in place, and it helps your stitches to lay neater. It just creates a firmer foundation if you have, because you're pulling against that, and if you have that vertical post there, it kind of holds the stitches more nicely. The reason I came down to this bottom hole to come up instead of going up here is because it slants the thread and it opens up that hole that I went down in over here. It creates a nicer angle for that top leg to lay on that stitch over here. And it creates a nicer angle for the bottom leg of this stitch. If I had come straight over here, it would have, it also kind of opens up the hole here, so if I have another stitch to put in there, it creates more space for it. There's just all kinds of reasons why it's better to have your thread underneath slanting either back or down rather than straight across, straight up, just for the look of your stitches on top. All right, let me look at my notes here. So as you can see, counting is important when you're working with even weaves. There are going to be times when your counting is off. There are going to be times when I'm going to come down here and make a stitch underneath this single one. There are going to be times when you accidentally, instead of coming up like I'm supposed to in that bottom right, I miss it and come up in the center stitch. So I'm only going over, and then you go down. So I end up only going over one of the threads. See that? So let me show you what that looks like. And you will tell pretty quickly that you've made that mistake and say, okay, I'm going down in the correct hole. So I've made the top leg correct, but the bottom leg is just over one thread. And you can tell pretty quickly that that's a mistake, because basically there's too much fabric showing there. And if you get to the point where you're like filling in around it and it's like, huh, something about that doesn't look right, it's because it's not. You could continue on and not worry about it. Again, what you frog and what you don't frog is up to you, but I encourage you to go back and fix it. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to take that out. The other way that you will miscount, and I say will because it happens to all of us, mistakes and frogging is a fact of life in cross stitch, is say you've jumped, let me snip this off while I'm talking so I have an even edge to rethread my needle. Say you've jumped over a ways and you're working on a border. We all know how much we like borders, huh? And how much we dread the idea of it not meeting up. But what if it meets up kind of, sort of, except you're off by one thread? So let's say I continue here. I don't notice that I've started in here, that I've started one in, right? And I do two, and I do two. And then I come over here and I'm about to do this next one. And I notice, well, wait a second. I should be lining up with this square here, right? But if I'm going up 2 over 2, I'm coming down in the middle of that square. That means I got off somewhere. And so, and of course, it's not as obvious without that cross thread over here. This gets even more difficult on linen, I will admit, and as you get into the higher counts, where the squares are smaller, it definitely is something that happens. But as you come over here, you realize, yep, I'm off. So then you have to backtrack, and you have to frog that. There's no question. You can't continue on and like, well, I'll just do one here and that'll make it even. I mean, you could, but I encourage you to just go ahead and take that out and make it right. As you get more of the stitching in, as your brain, you know, our brains are marvelous things. Our eyes are marvelous things. You will get to the point where you start seeing the squares just automatically on your fabric. And it will just become natural to stitch on this type of fabric. Now, you may need readers. I use readers. I couldn't stitch without readers. I don't use a magnifier at this point. There will come a time when I do. I need good lighting, you know, so all of those things that hold true for your other stitching is true for this as well, even more so. But again, just be careful at the beginning. Just take your time. Enjoy the process. Know that you will get better as time goes on. Just with everything, right? Just as with everything. Practice makes perfect. Now, what type of pattern should you choose to begin with? I encourage you to choose ones smaller. Start with a smaller pattern so you don't get too frustrated or too overwhelmed. And start with a one that has bigger blocks of color, more solid blocks of color. Try not to choose one that has you jumping too far away to do little motifs. You know, a couple stitches, do that. You got to get used to counting. You got to get used to figuring that out. But don't do ones that have like a snowflake here and a snowflake here and a snowflake here. You know, don't do that to yourself. Now, having said that, if I had like a little house with smoke going up and a snowflake here and a snowflake here and a snowflake here, and you do happen to get off by one thread, nobody's going to notice that. Nobody, when they're looking at your finished piece, is going to be counting the threads and saying, oh, that one's off by one thread, as long as there's nothing else that's going to come in around it that will show that that is off. And chances are you won't see it either, unless you count and recount. All right, guys, so I think that's all I have to share with you today about transitioning to an even weave fabric. I think I've answered most of the questions I usually get. Please do let me know if I've missed anything, if there's anything else you need me to help you with. You know, I'm always here to answer your questions. Yeah, I think that's about it. So I will see you again probably pretty soon. Until then, have a lovely day, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.